and welcome to the Virtual FantasyCon 2017 panel on gender issues in fantasy. We're going to be covering a couple of different aspects with that today. We're going to discuss gender issues for authors, and we're also going to discuss gender issues in the fiction itself. I'm your host today. I'm Diane Morrison. I'm the author of the Weird West Chronicles and a couple of things in some anthologies here and there. And my interest in this panel is that I am demigender. Primarily, I identify as female, but there's also an aspect of me that sometimes doesn't, sometimes identifies as male, right? I use she, her pronouns, so that's fine. And I'm also writing a fantasy epic on that is centered around a transgender character.
All right, my name is Sarah Buhrman. I am the writer of the Runespells series, and I also write erotica under the name Lena Grace. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because I write, the series that I'm writing actually involves transgender, bisexual, homosexual, and, you know, pretty much the entire LGBTQ plus spectrum in the series. So I personally am cis and hetero, at least as much as can be determined. Mostly I don't really think about gender. I'm just kind of happy being me, and I'm not really sure what that is, but, you know, mostly it's female, I guess. But I also have a lot of friends and acquaintances, including my husband, who are on the LGBTQ spectrum. So,
okay, hi, I'm Lyra Shanti, and I'm the author of the science fantasy series called Shiva 14. The main character is actually both male and female physically. So that is quite different from a lot of other science fantasy series, I believe. It kind of isn't front and center, but it is a huge deal to him. Oops, sorry. A huge deal to Ein. He is the main character. He's inside, he identifies as male, and he's kind of raised to be so, but it's an issue throughout the whole thing. So it's sort of a trans intersex character. And he is also born to be the Messiah of his planet. So it's a huge expectation on him, and they don't really want him to have this issue. So he's dealing with that. It's a secret throughout the whole thing. And he has to find his own belief in himself, belief in who he really is, what his real path is. So all throughout the series, there's that. And then there's also other LGBT characters. There are bisexual characters, gay characters, as much diversity as I could fit into it, because I believe diversity is very, very, very important, whether gender or race or any kind of thing, because that's the world we live in. And to not show that would be unrealistic, and it wouldn't feel right, and it just wouldn't be fun, and it wouldn't be what our life is. There's LGBT themes throughout all of Shiva. And for myself, well, you know, it's personal, but I do keep fluid, I do keep open, and I'm quite an LGBT supporter.
My name is Tahani Nelson. I just finished publishing my first novel, which is called The Last Fight. The Last Fight is really interesting in the fact that it's a matriarchal society. Women are the ones that are allowed to be in the army, and they're the only ones that are allowed to use magic. And so it's very, very different from the society that we currently live in right now. But anytime someone is oppressed for long enough, they're going to rise up and try to take their part of society back. So Kaya, the main character, has no idea that she's even an oppressor until men start trying to fight her order and trying to make things a little bit more equal. So it's a very feminist book from the opposite viewpoint of what we normally see. So I'm very, very excited about it. Originally, I didn't even have any romance relationships in the novel until my beta readers pointed out that Kaya and another female character really meshed well together and asked me if I could think about letting them be together, because I was very mean to them throughout the story and they deserve a little bit of happiness. So you can't stop love, I guess.
I'm Katja Van Loon. I'm a non-binary gendered kind of gone through a lot of permutations as to what it is, but I guess gender fluid is probably the best term. I don't know. My pronouns are Zer, but they, them, she, her, whatever. Yeah, that's where I'm standing from. And I've identified as bisexual for 16 years, even though it's actually practically a lot more complicated than that. It's just like bisexual is like the easiest term, and there's sort of a solidarity, because I was bisexual for a while before I was like, you know what, it's weirder. And then I didn't want to like leave the term because there's so much bi erasure and biphobia out there that I was like, no, bisexual, raw. So
Sorry.
Anger is my identity. So I've got 2 book series out right now. One of them is also actually set in a matriarchal society, but it's sort of in the benevolent sexism phase of it. Like the dudes have rights and stuff. They're still like, it's like benevolently sexist towards them, and they're just like, what? We have good lives, everything's fine. And I'm actually planning on writing a story like set couple of generations after my main stories right now, where there is like a men's right movement and like, hey, you know, we don't have the same rights and blah blah blah, and you know, there will be men who are like, you're complaining about, you know, nothing, blah. So that's a fun thing to do. In my world, I've swapped the terms husband and wife, so husband is the female spouse and wife is the male spouse. And the thing is, though, is even though it's a matriarchal society and men are, you know, somewhat oppressed, it's also a very sex positive society. Almost everybody in my novel is bisexual or pansexual or anything goes sexual. They're all like Jack Harkness, really. So, and I, with a couple exceptions, I have a character who is demisexual, though she doesn't know that's the term for it. And I have a character who is heteroflexible. So he's heterosexual, except for this one guy who's sexy. And then the other story I have is about a goddess who falls to a planet where her followers have lost faith in her and she becomes mortal. And it explores gender a lot, because she falls to this planet in search of a friend of hers who's a non-binary god from a different planet who had also fallen to this planet. And I use a range of different pronouns in the book, and I'll be exploring themes of gender and sexuality as the series goes on. So
that's pretty cool. You guys went into a lot more detail about your plots than I did. But I did like a machinima trailer for the book idea, and I'll put it up. You can find it here on YouTube, or I can also put the link in my booth, which I will do. Basically, my idea with that one was that, okay, so it was based on a role-playing game, as many of my stories tend to start with, and don't diss me, I don't care. And I couldn't make up my mind which gender I wanted the character to be at the time. People were all like, you play a lot of male characters, you should play some more female characters. I'm like, whatever, right? So I finally decided that I was going to make the character male. And then I think because I had so much difficulty deciding, they decided that, okay, whatever gender I said, they were going to flip it, right? And then that was going to be required in order to be the ruler of the land that the character was lost heir to, right? And I went, okay, fine. Yeah, you know what? Never mind. I realized they probably did it kind of partially as, you know, humor. But I was like, no, I'm going to take this seriously. How would I feel? What would happen to this character, you know? So his name is Vaughn. Vanya was the name he was given at birth. And he is not very impressed with his transformation, and of course has to deal with a whole bunch of the general sexist crap of his society as well, which can be interesting because he's been raised his whole life to, you know, eventually take over the throne, and he's trained in war, and women don't do these things in his society, so there's a lot of conflict with that. So I'm so excited that so many people here are doing all these variety stuff. I have an idea for a story. I'm not going to get into it, but it's also a matriarchy, so I can relate to Tahani as well. Let's start with why we think these are important things. Like, why is it that we're writing these different takes on things? Why are we making a point of putting gender diversity and LGBTQ aspects right into our stories?
Well, I can tell you that every time I get into a conversation with people usually in author groups online, about doing gender equality, about having more female characters, about, things like that, there's always the white boy. Now, I'm not talking about all white guys. Okay, I'm talking about the white boy. The white boy who comes in and says, well, I think that, there's plenty of gender equality and I don't really care what the character is like as long as the story is good.
We all smiled because we all knew exactly who you were talking about.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I love the white boy, especially when I get to make him cry. Okay, that is like my goal in life. I'm like, wow. Because, I mean, the thing is, it's not that there aren't any women characters. It's that how many women characters are there that we can actually find and actually appreciate, who aren't sitting there thinking about their breasts, who aren't sitting there, trying to have some sort of sexual relationship. I'm all fine and dandy with a sexual relationship, but does it have to be all the time? I think I have a pretty decent sex drive, and I don't think about sex that much. It's like,
Yeah.
wow. You see these conversations all the time where, people are like, well, I swear to whatever gods you believe in, I had a conversation where the response was, well, is anybody actually even writing white males anymore?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep.
I was just
Well,
like,
that's what
are you kidding
privilege
me?
looks like, isn't it? Right? I mean, that's privilege, right? People, if you're a part of the privileged group, you don't realize that other people aren't being represented because you don't notice, right? Everything's designed for you. So why would you even think about these other things? So
Doesn't that get boring to them? I mean, that's what mystifies me. Like, I mean, yes, they're privileged, and yes, that's what they're used to. But God, don't they get bored of seeing the same thing? They always like, oh, Hollywood and things, it's just everything's the same, blah, blah, blah. But, I mean, that's because it's always catered around to them. The white boy, So, I mean, yeah, that's what I was saying before. Like, diversity is everywhere in life. To shut your eyes to it is just idiotic to me. And what you were saying, Sarah, it's just like, it reminded me of when they announced the female doctor, and I was all, yay,
People's minds
I was all into it. A lot of us were. But of course, I had at least 3 or 4 white boys that got very pissed, and especially British ones. And they just were going on, and they kept saying, oh, no, it's not that I'm sexist, but, and it really is. They just can't face it. So, I mean, yeah, it's really important that gender issues, diversity, all of it is put out front and center, whether it's a female doctor or whether it's a trans character or whatever it is, because that is the world we live in, and they've got to open their eyes already.
I think there's something to be said for comfort in media that we consume. I know that when I'm having a really shitty day, I like to sit down and watch something that is like comfortable to me, whether that means it's something I've seen before or something where I know I can expect certain tropes. And if I turn on something where I'm expecting certain tropes and they deviate from those tropes, I get really upset because it's like, no, I wanted, magical girls fighting evil, and you've turned Sailor Moon into a grimdark Game of Thrones like spinoff. What? I mean, not that I've ever seen that, but you know what I mean? Like,
Aren't you?
like you expect certain tropes, and I think that's why it doesn't get boring for people, is they expect certain tropes, and then they keep on, and so when they open something and they're expecting a trope and it's not there, it really does hit your comfort zone line, and it makes you upset. And I think that's why we get such knee-jerk reactions from people is they're expecting something and then their expectations have been destroyed, and it's not comfortable for any human to deal with that, because we're very much creatures of habit and comfort.
I hear you, Katja,
Yeah.
but again, that would be boring to me. I mean, like, I do have the comfort thing. But I mean, there's times I just want the cute anime, But but it gets boring to me very fast, and that's why I just can't roll. The world needs to stop doing that so much. I mean, fun and comfort is all well and good, but you just can't close your eyes.
Like, I'm just trying to point out like where they're probably coming from, and like if we can understand that, then we can better interact with it. I think I'm always trying to like understand other sides so that I can better like talk to them and maybe change their views, or maybe not, but
it's very hard to change their views. I mean, I
Yeah.
try very, very calmly and diligently and to try to just, and understand their point of view and get all that. But they're very, very fixed into what they're used to. And it is interesting, though, because I've had a lot of men read Shiva, and, with anything that I've brought up, none of them have had a problem with it at all. And none of them have seemed uncomfortable. Just, I don't know, you hit certain nerves with them. Something like you said, the comfort zone. And
So I designed my own cover for my book. I'm going to show it to you one more time, just because.
Yes.
There is a black woman on the front of this book, and she's wearing pants. Well, you can't see her pants anymore. But do you have any idea how hard it is to find women that are wearing pants or clothes at all with a sword for fantasy, or women that are of color, especially in stock images? It's insane. Like, apparently it's already unexpected for us to be able to carry swords, which I've got like 4 of them back there for you if you ever need some. But you either can't find women that are carrying swords, women that cannot carry a sword and wear pants at the same time, or women that are wearing clothing. Like, I don't understand how fantasy is so anti-keeping your body parts intact.
You have such a good point there. It's so true. I tried to find a, this is for the Weird West, which is not related to the other story I'm writing, but I was trying to find my female lead, Emma, right? She's mixed race. I was trying to find a good picture, and you can find some stuff in contemporary clothing, but, try to find anybody in, like, Western gear, right? No, anything unusual at all. Oh, yeah, we covered it. We got the mixed race, people of color over here. Yeah, okay. And they're all dressed in T-shirts,
Right, finding people of color in any sort of niche photo is almost impossible. And that's if we're talking about African Americans, which is the most common people of color you're going to find. If you want anybody that's Latina or anybody that is from the Middle East, and you want them to not look like a stereotypical person of that race, it's almost impossible. And that's very telling of our society, I think.
I have an issue with that because my main character, Ayn, his whole culture is more Asian based. I don't say it's Asian because it's a whole other galaxy and a whole other world, but it's basically that. You can tell from the flavor and the feel of it. So I've been trying so desperately to find stock photos, or whether, I wanted to make a trailer. All of that stuff is so hard. So yeah, absolutely. It's very, very difficult to find that.
Yeah, for my book covers, for the first one, I actually had to get a friend in a park in Vancouver, and we borrowed my mother-in-law's red wig. And my husband has a gigantic sword. We went and we got her dressed up in like a costume that was like, pants and a shirt, and we took a picture, and then I futzed around in Photoshop a bit. But, I was like, I didn't even look at stock photos because there's no way I'm going to find what I want. And for the second book, the main character is mixed race. She's, it's never said outright, but she's part Mayan, part Etherian, which is whatever blend of whatever these people are. It's colonized by humans like centuries ago, which tend to be sort of paler people. And for that, I had to use a piece of artwork from a South American artist. Because there was nothing. But I've actually redesigned the covers now to go more abstract because I just like.
That's what I ended up.
Because you got exhausted trying to match it.
Mm-hmm. I'm never gonna find anything for Anala, like ever. Like it's just not gonna happen. So.
Yeah. So basically, what I'm hearing is that we all think it's important because we want to see faces that look like our own, faces that look like our friends' faces. People like the people we know in fiction. We don't want the same, 6 people offered to us. We want people who remind us of real people.
Yeah, representation matters.
Yep. I have yet to see a fat girl on a cover of a book. Unless it's
There's so many. Oh, yeah. That's a soapbox issue for me. As a teenager, I had an eating disorder. So body positivity is a very big thing for me. I do not understand why we cannot appreciate people of different sizes. I don't understand it, just adapt already. People are different shapes,
I love it when women are described as being, curvy and they're like 130 pounds, and I'm like,
Yeah, come on, please.
what?
Yeah.
Unless you're like under 5 foot, the curves are not there. I'm sorry.
Hey, I'm 5 feet tall. I'm 120 pounds. Okay. Right?
In all the right places.
You know, come on now.
I'm not sharing my height and weight because
Me neither.
I break the scale, so I'd probably break my computer somehow.
Just know that if I get my speed up and come running at you, you better get out of the way.
Juggernaut, right? Like just.
I
right
came in
wall.
like a wrecking ball, okay?
Nice.
Yeah, that's.
People always
that's my
like,
husband.
I'd rather see somebody that's fit. And I'm like, I could probably bench press you. So it's up to you on what you think fit is.
Right.
Oh, like, I'm sorry, what? I have known so many, like, fat people like me who are super strong, and the amount of skinny girls I knew in high school were like, oh, this pen is heavy. Like, come
So
on.
right.
Yeah, it's like okay, if I get on the floor, I have to get myself back up. That
Yeah.
means that I can lift my own weight.
Exactly, right? I can lift my own weight, so I'm already stronger than you, just by virtue of that.
One time I was doing an exercisey, fad thingy, and my mom's like, well, you could put like weights on your ankles. And I'm like, because I need to carry around more weights? What?
It's on your ankles.
I'm already carrying around twice as much as everybody else going around this group.
You have really strong ankles.
Yeah,
Really
fit has
strong ankles.
nothing to do with size. Nothing. And well, okay, actually, I won't even say that. You're right. Larger people do tend to be stronger. That's a fact. Because the bigger you are, the more muscle mass you have, the stronger you generally are. That is absolutely the truth.
There should be a big warrior woman. Do you have anything like that, Tahani?
Brienne of Tarth! I love Brienne of Tarth so much.
Oh my
She's
goodness,
so
right.
awesome for so many reasons as character. Okay, except that brings up another issue. They're having a supermodel play her, right? Like in the TV show. Brienne of Tarth is not supposed to be a pretty woman. She has scars from fights and crooked teeth. Why can't you just give us a person who looks like a human being? I appreciate
a female
the fact.
person.
Yes, a female person who looks like a
'Cause-
human being. What a concept,
yeah.
right?
Because the Hound ain't no pretty guy.
No.
Actually, that brings up a good point, though. Can we discuss why we think that this is like it is now? Like, there has to be some reason that our society is built this way, and in order to break past it, we have to know how it got to this point. Like, why do you guys think that women are so rare in fantasy, and why do you think they have to look like supermodels?
One, the women should be at home raising the kids, taking care of the house. That's why you don't see them. They're in the house. Two, they have to be pretty because we've been trophies for so long. That's the thing. Women have been bought and sold either through marriage or actual slavery for so long in so many cultures. The only value that we've been given in so many points in history is how attractive we are to people. So, even now, you get people shaming women who don't wear makeup or who wear too much makeup or who are just like the wrong look. It's crazy because, it's like my husband can roll out of bed, doesn't even brush his hair half the time, and he goes to work and I'm like, dude. But I could never get away with that.
Well, the idea of what's attractive changes so much throughout time, but also through subcultures. In my normal over culture, I cover my hair every day for personal spiritual reasons, and that is in the over culture that we have, that's considered weird and freaky and definitely not attractive. But if I were a Jewish woman, be completely normal. Completely normal and probably considered attractive. Okay, if you're fat like I am, because I am fat, and you've ever been to a Latin American country, the men there like bigger women. And this is just a generalization, but it's I got so much attention whenever I traveled in Latin America that I would never get up here in Canada or in the States where I was living for a while. But there was a lot, like it made me super uncomfortable because I didn't know how to handle it because I was not used to that sort of attention. And all of a sudden I have all these men flirting with me. I'm like, what's going on? What's happening? Am I in bizarro world? You know, but that's a different culture and they have a different idea of what's attractive. It's really interesting how it doesn't matter what culture you're in, like mostly if you're a woman or a person socially classed as woman, you need to be attractive to be worth something. But what that attractiveness is going to vary so much. So you're just kind of like screwed no matter where you are, because I'm attractive here, but not over here. Great. Like,
I think it's entirely about economics. In most of the cultures that we're familiar with, inheritance has passed from father to son. They're the ones with the money and the property. So in order for women to have money and property, they have to make themselves valuable in some way to the people with the property, who are the boys. Now, I know of 2 cultures on Earth that are exceptions to this. There is a culture in Africa, wish I could remember the name, right? But the women inherit all the property. And so what happens is the men reach a certain age, right? And then they do this like big dance festival thing where they're all like batting their eyes and, you know, trying to be all smiley and all the stuff that we women do when we're flirting to try to attract the attention of some woman who's going to marry him and take him home so he has some stuff. And then there's another culture it's somewhere in China. Yeah, I should know these things. I wish I'd written them down.
Tibet? There's a matrilineal culture in Tibet.
Is it Tibet? Then I'm thinking, okay, yeah. Well, yeah, exactly, right? And the women own all the property there too, right? And there isn't really marriage as we understand it in Western culture. You know, you're married as long as you live in the house. When she kicks you out, you're not married anymore. And men kind of live where they can. And there's usually, like, often there's one woman and a couple of different guys. And she owns all the property. And in some cases, they can be very abusive and controlling in ways that we are used to associating with men in our culture. It's all about the money.
It's all about power and money. And I mean, this is why like abuse isn't just a thing that, like, I see a lot of people acting as if abuse is a thing that men do to women and that women never abuse people. And I'm like, no, women can be like ridiculously abusive. It depends on who has the power differential in that relationship. And sometimes that's money, but other times it's other things. And, you know, it's interesting to tease out what power is in relationships. It could be who has more social capital in the social circles that you're traveling. People are just people, and people can abuse people. And I mean, basically we're just a garbage species. Or have the potential to be garbage.
I think this is also why the overculture is so threatened by people who do not fit the gender binary right now. Because, okay, first of all the gender roles over the past generation have started to break down. Now, we have a lot of baggage that our generation in particular is still carrying, right? Us Generation X and millennial types. We're still carrying all that crap. But it's outdated. It's done. Like, we don't need it anymore. Our kids probably aren't going to have these, you know, the same baggage in the same way. I've already seen signs that they don't. So cool. So already the social norms and the way we've divided societal roles and economics have broken down. And now there's people who, okay, they've always been there. We know they've always been there, but people are seeing now and noticing people who don't fit the binary and saying, what, you want to break it down even further, you know? And all the abuse that happens and all the discrimination it's geared towards you should stay in your place, you know? That's
so much of it is you should stay in your place, and we're very quickly finding out that there's not one place for any person, and that makes people uncomfortable. Like, there's so many different places each person can fit, but we seem to want to be corralled into these tiny little canisters, and it's really arbitrary thing so much of the time.
Yeah, and the worst part is a lot of females actually are okay with that, and they seem to support their husbands on it. They seem to be fine with that, and that's what really frightens me politically and you know, socially. A lot of females, a lot of women are kind of what I think brainwashed into thinking that their place is still following their husbands, following their fathers, doing what they've always been told to do. And I think until that really changes, like hugely changes, I mean, it's changing, but I think feminism can't be a dirty word, and they can't be afraid of it. Though the witches who were burned need to stand up again and say, we're back, you know, with a vengeance. Yes, I know, but it has to be big. Widespread.
We are the daughters of the witches you couldn't burn.
It is happening, like you said, Diane, but it's like we're still in the in-between world, but it's happening. It's happening right now.
I think one of the reasons that feminism is considered such a dirty word is that a lot of people seem to think that feminism means that we want to replace men as the dominant species, but feminism is all about equality. We just want an equal spot in society and in fantasy books and in the world. And men tend to see equality as replacement. I shouldn't say men, that was not fair. That was not fair at all to say. Anti-feminists seem to see that as a chance to replace, and it's not right.
Same thing about racism as well. You know, people who are upset about Black Lives Matter or whatever else. If you're fighting for equality and to be seen as equal, a lot of these people will see it as a threat to them. And it goes back to you know, what we were talking about earlier with what they find safe in the comfort zone. Again, I just think, how can anybody live like that? I would just be, I couldn't deal with it.
I think if we're gonna make sure that people stop seeing feminism as a dirty word, an important thing to do is to make sure there's also room for those of us who have left feminism and no longer identify with it because of the abuse we've suffered at the hands of feminists and because of the toxic discourse that has become so prevalent in so many feminist spaces. I left feminism. I'm done with it because I was a feminist for a very long time and I kept trying to find a way to have discourse with people that wasn't toxic, and basically it ended up destroying my mental health and making me completely suicidal to try and remain a feminist. And so, but the thing is like, that doesn't mean that my ideals have changed. My ideals are the same. It's just I'm not really interested in being part of a lot of the spaces where these feminist conversations happen, because so often it's people who are doing this toxic discourse that doesn't actually lead to any change. There's no nuance in the conversation. There's a party line and you toe it. I have gotten so much flack basically just for having a cisgendered heterosexual husband. And you know, like he's one of the first people I came out to when I discovered I was non-binary, and I was so terrified, and he was just like, whatever. Like, I still love you.
I love you for you.
But whatever, like, I don't care. You know, and I was like, so you don't care if we go out and I'm presenting as male? And he's like, like, you know, but like, there's so much stuff in like mainstream feminism shit that's like, oh, well, you know, white men are the problem. White cisgender heterosexual men. I can't believe you married. You're a traitor. I'm like, what? Like, and I get this, like, I've gotten this a lot. I don't know. I've got a lot of thoughts about it, but yeah.
No, you're right. Like, this is important to discuss. There is a stream within the feminist discourse that is very anti-male. This is also where TERFs tend to come from, which, for those who may not know, stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. With this idea that people who do, you know, are trans are like trying to invade the special sacred woman space. Like,
here's the thing that really bothers me about the idea of trans invading the female feminist space. They are the feminists who say that, which I consider extremist feminists. Mm-hmm. They're not actually realizing what being trans means. That means that they identify inside their minds and souls as, I guess in that case, it would be female. A trans woman is not a man. Right. That's the whole point. And they're just not getting that. And to not get that is just sexist and horrible.
I agree with you. I think it's all connected though, right? Okay, why does your mother-in-law give you crap when they come over, you know, when she comes over and the house is a mess? Why not the other person you're with?
Well, because cleaning is women's work.
Right, and she's been taught that.
Right.
She believes, you know, even if she doesn't like believe it here, right? She believes it in her gut. She believes that okay, yes, you can go off and have your career and do all that stuff, but you got to do all this other stuff too. And she's had to accept that in order for her life to have meaning, because otherwise she would get very resentful and have to accept the fact that a bunch of people in her life have forced her to do things which she doesn't, you know, she shouldn't have to do, and have made it her responsibility when why should it be, right?
That is probably the biggest thing that I've run into with particularly older generations, is they're afraid to admit that they were, you know, to some degree or another, abused. They think that their lives are okay, and that's fine if you think your life is okay, but to say that some people feel abused or oppressed by this situation, they would have to admit that maybe, just maybe, they too were abused and oppressed, and that is extremely difficult to get through. You know, that is a huge barrier on so many levels.
That was very well said.
Yeah, exactly right. So I think that's what it is. I think that the whole idea there in second wave feminism in particular, there was a whole branch of, okay, different but equal was the whole theory, right? The chalice and the blade, you know, men are about war and women are about peace. Nonsense, okay? I think this is complete and utter garbage. I don't believe a word of it. I don't think there's anything that is gendered behavior other than what culture prescribes, right?
That's probably why we wrote so many matriarchal novels, is because we wanted to show that it could work.
Exactly. But in order for second wave feminists to have recognition as equality, as equals, they had to claim, oh, we're different, but we're equal. Because nobody would listen to, yeah, you know, women aren't more nurturing than men are. Sorry, guys.
I think it isn't so specific, like what men are from Mars, women are from Venus. That's baloney. You know, there isn't like a one door goes here, one door goes there, and that's what we fit into. You know, humans are way more complex than that. We all have sensitivity. We all have strength. We all have that. But you know, you go way back into our history, and of course, you know, caveman times, and you know, men were the ones who had to go out because they were physically stronger and go fight and hunt and all that, and women stayed and cooked or whatever. And that's where the Neanderthal brain is still at for so many people. But we obviously are more than just what our bodies are. We're more than just one, you know, aspect and nothing else. Women can be nurturing, men can be nurturing. Women can be strong, men can be strong. It's just, we all have this in us. And I think when it comes to identity, it's really all about what makes you feel comfortable, what body you feel comfortable in, what you feel is you, how you want to represent. And like Katja, it could be different each day, and that's fine too. But I mean, I feel like the thing is, society, especially Western society, tends to not only not want to admit that they've been abused or suppressed, because that's a big point, that is true. But I think it also goes deeper, where they just don't want to accept that something is there behind the physical body that they just can't see. And that goes into like a human thing of not accepting things we don't understand. And what we can't see is not there. It's just not there. And if you try to, you know, bring something to the table that they don't see, it's a human issue to not see what's inside something that they can't actually physically or easily understand.
I do want to just defend my Neanderthal best friend, though, because they're actually far more compassionate and equality-minded than Homo sapiens, and then they end up getting interbred with Homo sapiens and then dying out, but some of us have Neanderthal DNA. Sorry, anthropology, like, aficionado. So
it goes back to the same issue that seems to pervade, you know, sexism, racism, all the isms, all the ists, and that is, it's not that simple. It just, you know, people want it to be that simple, but it's really, really not. But at the same time, I mean, can you imagine from a biological perspective, if our brains were geared towards constantly picking apart all of those details for all of the things that we see and all of the people that we meet, you know, that's a lot of information. So it's easy to understand why, you know, we're kind of geared towards just picking the easy understanding. But, you know, we keep forgetting to force ourselves to open up to those more complex understandings when it's necessary.
For those of all of us here who write like epic sci-fi fantasy, what? We do complex. We do it every day. We can do this. Come on, give it the program, people.
Our psyches work really, really hard to keep us safe. And that's why people get delusional about things, and that's why it's really hard to change someone's worldview, is because your brain is geared with keeping you safe, and that means rejecting any of that stuff that conflicts with whatever's in there already. Like, your brain will make up entire stories to explain things, even when what you saw was very much not what your brain made up. And this is actually why we can't even really like trust our memories or anything, because the brain's just like edit. And every time you remember something, it's like a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. You never have the original memory. Basically, our brains are just really out to get us, and we have to fight them because they don't want us to feel unsafe. They don't want us to feel uncomfortable. They want us to feel safe and comfortable, because if we're safe and comfortable, then, you know, we keep feeding the meat suit that keeps them going. So
our brains are essentially a only semi-beneficent parasite.
Basically, yes.
Ew. Oh, come on. We only use like, what, 10%? I mean, maybe there's a lot more going on that we could use.
Well, okay, I'm just saying, you know, we got authors right here. Challenge accepted here.
Yeah, that's right.
The 10% brain thing is actually a myth. We use pretty much all of our brain. I think where people are coming from that with that though is that we only consciously use like 10% of our.
Right.
And if we could consciously affect other factors in our brain, we'd be a lot more powerful, like the Bene Gesserit from Dune. So.
Challenge accepted again. More challenges to accept.
Actually, it's interesting that you brought up Dune, because that's one of the things, you know, that's an element where it kind of it challenges our general belief here that I think I'm gathering from. I think we seem to be in accord that you can be anything you want, and, you know, gender and none of this stuff, this is not that simple, and you can't categorize anybody. But one of the premises of Dune is that women have different abilities from men. And the big thing about the Kwisatz Haderach, right, is that he's the guy who could do the stuff that the women could do and the stuff that men could do. And not to say that I didn't like Dune, one of my favorite books, but
I could never tell if that was like a send-up of women or a takedown. I just could never tell. It's kind of like they're the all-knowing beings who can do all the spiritual stuff, and men are usually dumb, I guess. But like, but that's like saying, oh, like I can do it too. I don't know if that's like saying women are better, but maybe a man can do it, or if it's saying men can do anything women can do. I really, yeah, it's a complicated thing there, but it's a great book, great series, but yeah, who knows?
I always kind of saw it as if we kind of try to erase the things that we use to separate our genders, we become stronger.
A good message to take out of it. You have a point there.
Yeah.
That's a good one. And let's face it, right? The Bene Gesserit are like powerful women that are really, you know, like I emulated to some degree some of the stuff that they were doing, you know. I've got the fear verse memorized, you know, right? And I did that.
Fear is the mind killer.
Yeah, fear is a little death that brings total obliteration. Yeah,
I repeat it when I need to get blood drawn. So needles.
Yeah, I guess, okay, for me, in a large part, you know, like obviously we've agreed that this isn't just an issue in fantasy. The reason why it's an issue in fantasy, that gender representation among characters is an issue, is because it is in the overculture that we're from as well.
Absolutely,
right?
yes.
So we write fantasy that challenges these things because we want to explore that idea. And for me, fantasy is supposed to be unrealistic, right? Fantasy is where you go, what if this happened? Let's follow it through. Let's see where it goes. I like to challenge our preconceptions about a lot of things in my fantasy, because I want people to maybe think, okay, we don't have to live in this box. You know, things do not have to work like this. They can work in different ways. this is one way in which it could work. Go ahead, and you know, and there will be problems, right? There's always problems. Nothing's perfect, but let's consider these other ideas. Let's consider these different cultural ways of doing things.
Yeah, to make fantasy work, you have to make it realistic too. And that's true for any genre, but especially in fantasy and sci-fi, you have to make some level of realism, especially in magic. There has to be some level of like why that would work. You can't just have magic and then it just gets silly if there's no explanation to it. At least for science fantasy, which is what I write, it really, realism, I have to throw it in there as much as I can. I have the main energy source called plasma, which I didn't at the time realize was actually an energy source and a cutting edge one, but that's where I went with it when I wrote it by instinct. I was heavily influenced by Dune. So yes, they're coveting this energy source. And I had to really kind of study up a bit. I kind of made it my own version of plasma. It's not really, you know, a gas thing, it's different. But to some degree, having to meld science and fantasy at the same time constantly. And obviously you have to make characters realistic. You have to make them, you know, show why they would do things, make that feel real. There has to be a level of realism. Otherwise, fantasy just gets silly.
Yeah, people won't buy it. If you don't put
Right.
some level
Literally.
of grounding in it, people, well, yeah, literally and figuratively. Yeah, people will be like, yeah, no, you know.
Yeah, and I have a theater background, and in theater we distinguish between realism and naturalism, because realism, if you did realism, actual realism in a play, nobody would accept it because it was too real. And there's a couple of playwrights who do something that's much closer to realism, where the dialogue is a lot closer to how people speak. It's really hard to memorize because with naturalism, it feels real, but there is an element of scriptedness to it that actually makes it possible to memorize the dialogue. Walker did Criminal Genius and the Suburban Motel series, and his dialogue, I've done a couple of the shows. His dialogue is so hard to memorize because he went for realism, and it means that, you know, like you're talking just like a regular person, which is not, like, I cannot recall what I said in a conversation yesterday. But if you give me a set of dialogue that's written to feel natural but not explicitly real, then that's a lot different. So I always try to go for like what I call, because of my theater background, I call it naturalism in my stuff, which is like, no, my characters, when they're talking, they're not talking like real, like the people here would talk, because it's a lot more edited, and, you know, they're a lot more witty too. My characters are so much more witty than I am, because I have time to think about what they say. In real life, I'm like,
That's one of the reasons why people today prefer to text instead of talking on the phone, because you have that moment to write it down instead. That's why conversations in film and in books are so much smoother than our actual conversations.
I like that naturalism. Yeah, we should start adopting that in prose writing as well. I think that's,
yeah,
because you're right.
Yeah.
If things are too realistic, people don't buy it, you know?
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, we already do that, because you don't write dialogue like, "Hey, how you doing?" I'm okay. Okay, because
That gets so boring.
right? Well, and when you edit videos, like, I don't know if you guys have ever edited videos, but oh my gosh, the number of times that I say, okay, like, so.
Word bridges.
Oh
Yeah.
my God, right?
I do, yeah. I do a video series where I play a drinking game while reading 50 Shades of Grey, and I'm basically hospital drunk by the end of every episode. And so when I go back to edit, I have to edit it while sober. You can't edit while drunk. And I go back to edit in the morning, and I'm just like, I want to go back in time and slap myself because I'm just going, or going on the table because I'm drunk. And that seemed like a good idea. So yeah, editing myself in vlogs, oh God, do not want.
I think for me in my series, I do a combination. Like in the beginning, I say like a lot, but in the beginning of the book, it's very stoic and very stilted, and some people have said it's hard to get into because in the beginning of the book, I'm talking about Shiva, it's the day priests at a temple, where Aina's he's growing up very sheltered, very secluded in this very Asian kind of almost Tibetan Buddhist way. So even the narration, not just the dialogue, some of it feels that almost vacuous feel. It's poetic. It's not like everyday, like, hi, how are you doing? And I did that on purpose because you need to feel what Ayn feels, and he feels very trapped and very secluded. And everything's very peaceful, but it's very like he doesn't know what his purpose is. The bigger world outside, he has no clue. Once everything falls apart and the story gets into high gear, and he meets a character who is very colloquial, very modern. He comes from a totally other planet that just says like and everything else. It gets much more modern, and then it changes as it goes on. So I feel like naturalism is key. That's actually a good term for it. But you never want to, of course, sound like a text either. But yeah, I try to do a combo.
Dialogue and writing is so difficult, and I think it's one of the things that many new authors really struggle with, is making their characters sound realistic, but also intelligent. I don't know how else to say it. Like, we don't sound nearly as intelligent as our characters when we're just talking back and forth. And it's a little bit off topic, but it's also on topic for our overall conversation. I don't know if you guys realize how male-centric our language is. Like, any of the romantic languages are very, very male-centric. My book's called The Last Fight, and it's called The Last Fight because I had to make up a language for the female world that I created, where the female is at the center of the language. And that's not something I'd ever really even noticed growing up until I started writing and I became an English teacher. And it's so ingrained in our heads, I don't even think that most people realize that that's a part of our society.
I had to make up like the title of my book is Bellica, which is a word I made up based off the Latin for war to refer to the generals in my military. They're bellicas, and only women can get that higher rank. And I had to come up with a different word for kingdom because there's no king.
That's the point. That's the point in my book, which is going to be called The Forever Throne. It's about halfway written, right? Constantly they're like, oh yeah, and the fate of the kingdom, and then Vaughn, who has given up much and is now in a woman's body, continually says queendom. I have to be a girl to take the throne. Queendom, God,
Yeah, no, there's like there's just so much. And also when you're like, I was thinking about like, oh well, I could use the word, I was using the word jovially, then I realized that comes from the word Jove, refers to a male. So I changed it to Junially because their main goddess is Juno. And I was like, oh, that makes more sense. It's like there's so many little things where, that's part of the reason I flipped husband and wife in my world, so that husband is the female spouse and wife is the male spouse. And anybody can marry anybody, so you can have two wives or two others, whatever. But like, I flipped it so that it would make people sort of think when they're like, I wanted to sort of shock people a little bit with some stuff.
I went a little bit different, and I changed the conjugations of words. If a word ends with O-I-I, it's for female. And if it ends with O-L-I, it's for male, which was not a conjugation I found in any other language, so I knew it was uniquely mine. And it comes to a point in part of the story where a male is awarded enough that he could become a Fa'i. And there's no word for that. There's no word for a male Fa'i. And I think that it's interesting to point out how much our language dictates what we feel like we can become. Like, the kingdom always has a king in it almost, even though we've had Queen Elizabeth since the dawn of time, it almost feels like.
As long as any of us can remember, for sure, right?
So it's still a kingdom, but she's been our queen, or the queen, forever.
As you mentioned, Her Majesty, it was an interesting point, right? That if Will and Kate's first baby had been a girl, she would have been in the line of succession. Queen Elizabeth has decided that gender is no longer relevant to that, right? So it's interesting. It's unfortunate almost that they had a boy first. Not that Prince George is so cute, but.
Well, what's also interesting is like when I was talking about how with the female Doctor Who, and how a few men that I knew, especially British men, were very up in arms. I kept thinking,
Doctor Who
you've had a
is an
queen
alien.
forever. That too, exactly. Why does it matter? But I kept thinking, you've had a queen forever. and you've had female prime ministers, maybe not ones they liked, but you know, they've had this female force of rulers and whatnot, and this should be no issue, and yet it is. It so is still. It's weird to me.
Yeah, it's especially weird with the, like, you know, if you've watched New Who, which I have so many times, like there are even lines in there about stuff like that. Like there's the episode where they go back in time and they watch the coronation, and the dad in the house is going like, oh, well, you know, I haven't put up the flags. That's women's work, isn't it? And you know, the doctor's like, Queen's a woman, right? Do you think she does the cooking and cleaning? I'm just asking. Like, you know, sort of. Is that really what you think? You know, and like they've played with that before, and also it's been clear that Time Lords, you know, gender is sort of something that we put on Time Lords, right? Because of course Sarah was mentioned, you know, and oh, he was a fun guy or a saucy wench, you know, like whatever, you know. It's there seemed to be a lot of I for myself when I was just like when they're like, oh hey, we have a woman doctor, I was like, cool. In the past few seasons, I feel like the show has gone really downhill, so I've sort of been meh on the show for a while anyway. So when they were like, oh look, female doctor, I'm like, that doesn't solve the problems of the strongly worded anti-abortion message in one of your episodes. I'm just saying.
I feel like it's fair to say that minorities, females, LGBT, people of color have more equality or are closer to being equal in this generation than in the past. Is that fair to say?
Depends on what culture we're looking at and what aspects of it. Okay, I'm 42, so I'm old enough to remember the 80s fairly well. And it's really interesting because in many ways, okay, so as far as careers and professionalism has gone, women are considerably doing better than they were in the 80s, okay? But as far as expectations of behavior and sexuality, nuh-uh, we've taken a plummet. We used to have a lot more freedom with that than we're currently given. And I refuse to conform to it.
I think there are cycles of backlash and reclaiming when it comes to this sort of stuff, because I mean, like when you're talking about the different but equal stuff earlier, a lot of like backlash to that idea of woman as nurturing was a rejection of anything that seemed even slightly like women's work. And so now you have a whole bunch of people who don't know how to sew a button or boil water or, you know, knit, and they make fun of you if you know how to do any of those things, you know, because I'm like, these are like zombie apocalypse skills, guys. Like it's a backlash against that sort of idea of women, you know, like, oh, well, we don't have to do any of that, so we're just gonna not do it and not learn it. And so I've actually been embarking on a year-long project to, I'm writing a book, and a nonfiction book that I'll be publishing under my pagan name, and it's going to be about like reclaiming the magic of women's work. But I'm sort of like teaching myself, I'm focusing each moon cycle on a different thing that's women's work, and I am trying to learn things and see how I feel about them, and you know, like, so next month I'm gonna try to tackle canning, which is gonna be murder in this kitchen, but all right. Yep. Because like that's something that never happened in my house, but so many people grew up with grandmothers doing canning every summer, you know, and so there's this weird sort of cycle of backlash and reclaiming. Like now we're reclaiming that sort of stuff, right? But there's also been a backlash against some stuff that was happening in the 80s or whatever, like for example, taking names when you get married. My mom did not take my dad's name. I got given a hyphenated version of their two names, which was an awful burden to grow up with, just saying. But later I did a legal change in my name to drop my biosire's name, and now I did not take my husband's name. And people call me Mrs. his last name all the time. I'm like, no, that's my mother-in-law. That is not me. And they've actually found that like the number of women who keep their own name or don't take their husband's names has gone down since the 80s. Like since like the number has like gone, like dropped. And it made me wonder, is this because they've actually said, oh yeah, you know, actually I prefer my husband's name, or is this just because like, oh well, of course I take my husband's name, that's normal? Like that's sort of what I'm wondering, is like, have you thought about it, or are you just going with like that's normal? Because I've run into backlash from people. Like I've had people get angry with me when they've learned that I didn't take my husband's name. Like, I didn't know it was your business.
I'm legally married too. I didn't take my husband's name either, but I'll answer to it. if somebody calls me Mrs. McCroy, okay. And he answers to Mr. Morrison, I'll add. So it's all good, right? Our son, we gave his name. I think our intention was to give daughters my name. There were none, you know. I do have daughters, but it's complicated. But they didn't come from my body, right? So, yeah.
Yeah.
I took my husband's last name, but it's because I teach high school English, and Nelson is easier to say than Dalrymple. So, and so things like